all. We're about to start our evening, so if you could start finding your way to your tables, we'll begin shortly. Thank you. Mulibwanji. Good evening. So to our honored guests, starting with the Dean of the Pardee School, Dr. Scott Taylor, our Bradford Morse Distinguished Lecturer, Vanessa Nakate, all our honored guests this evening, esteemed faculty who seem to be everywhere, so there may be an exam, be prepared, Victoria. To the fabulous staff, all our valued partners, treasured members of the African diasporas who are here, alumni, teachers and administrators from across the school districts, and especially from the Boston public school system, students, friends, and as we say from Southern Africa, all protocols observed. Don't you love that? It's a great way in diplomatic life to get out of the embarrassment of forgetting certain people's names. So I want to welcome you to the 70th anniversary celebration, our gala of the African Studies Center here at the Pardee School of Global Studies at Boston University. My name is Mark Storella, and I am the director of the center. I don't know which number director I am. 12th. Okay. So 70 years, that sounds like a lot. And 70 years is a lot, but I have to say I'm relieved that there's at least something in this room that is older than I am, which is the center itself. Later tonight, you're going to hear a little clip from one of the esteemed former directors, and that's the late Professor James Pritchett. And in his presidential address, you won't see this part, which he delivered as the presidential lecturer of the African Studies Association, he spoke of his role as director of the center and said that he was the guardian, the caretaker, the inheritor of such a precious piece of American history. So indeed, it falls to all of us here tonight to respect the incredible record of achievement of the African Studies Center, but even more importantly, to carry this tradition forward, which I know you all will. It's a tradition for 70 years of absolutely outstanding scholarship, of leading library resources, of prestigious academic publications in our 56th year, top language instruction, of, I'm told, where's Zoli? I think it's 15 languages we've taught over, or 16 languages we've taught over the last 15 years, and groundbreaking and I think extraordinarily valuable educational outreach to the American people, to our children, to our young people about Africa. Yes, let's hear it for all those folks. The African Studies Center is not just an institution, it's not just a record, it really is a community. And I want to say it warms my heart to see all of you here, the community that makes up this center to celebrate the 70th birthday. To some extent, that means all of you, since you are the center itself. Maybe you're all 70 years old too. Woohoo! That's plenty. All right, we're going to go right on with our program this evening. And so now it is my great honor to introduce our first speaker. And that first speaker is a deep Africanist, someone who has studied Africa, someone who has a particular love, let's face it, of Zambia, the most important country in Africa. Is that true? No, it's not true. But he's a person with an attachment to the entire continent, and he's now the leader, second leader, of the Pardee School of Global Studies. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome our dean, Dr. Scott Taylor.
Thank you, Ambassador Storella, for those kind words. Although I'm dressed like a waiter, I'm the dean. It's so nice to see you all this evening. Pull that up a little bit. All right. Okay. Thank you. To Ms. Vanessa Nakate, faculty, students, staff of the African Studies Center, honored guests, I'm delighted to join Ambassador Mark Storella in welcoming you to this celebration tonight, the 70th anniversary of the African Studies Center of the Pardee School of Boston University. Although I'm a native New Yorker, my interest in Africa goes back more than 3 decades. I studied Africa as an undergraduate, including as a student at the University of Nairobi, And when I decided to pursue an academic career in political science, it was my interest in Africa that motivated me. That intellectual curiosity about Africa and deeply personal interest in the continent and African studies has never waned in those 30-plus years. And I was honored to direct an African studies program at my previous institution for 13 years. And when I came to BU as dean of the Pardee School, I was thrilled to be able to lead a school that houses one of the finest African studies centers in the United States. Indeed, the African Studies Center is the crown jewel of the Pardee School and of BU. Our African Studies Center is widely admired through the field of African studies. It's the second oldest African Studies Center and one of the most prestigious in the country. The Department of Education, as you know, has for decades supported the work of the African Studies Center as a National Resource Center, Title VI, as part of the Title VI program. And we're immensely grateful for this support and investment that has allowed us to do so much, including the many languages that Ambassador Storella mentioned. The African Studies Center boasts 134 research and teaching faculty in 44 departments, spread across 14 colleges and professional schools. There are 17 at BU, so that's a pretty good ratio. This community has been teaching and learning about African issues literally for 7 decades, about Africa's cultural richness, its linguistic diversity, the philosophy, arts, politics, history, the environment, and so many other fields. And this inquiry has not only benefited generations of students and faculty, but it also has very much benefited the US and the world. The work of the African Studies Center is critical for the Pardee School as well. As Mark mentioned, the school itself is much younger than the African Studies Center, coming up on just 10 years. And the African Studies Center, like the other regional centers, were incorporated kind of under it, but are the stuff that makes us go. And as a school of global studies, we're not really worthy of the name global studies, in my view, without a vibrant African studies focus. In Africa, African studies, our students encounter all manner of global challenges and all the possibilities that we want them to grapple with as students in global affairs. Whether it's migration, the impact of climate change, issues of democracy and human rights, public health, peace building, economic development, human security, literature, from the majesty of great Zimbabwe to the modern day magic of Nollywood, it's all here. And that's what we want our students to see. So to the many students here tonight, I urge you to take advantage of or to continue to take advantage, rather, of the national treasure that is the African Studies Center. It's a privilege, it really, really is. Take it from me, to coming from an institution that didn't value Africa nearly as much. It is such a privilege to have this magnificent resource within the Pardee School and within this university. And to the Africa scholars and practitioners here, those here at BU, to our language instructors, and all of the hardworking African Studies Center staff, I offer my deepest thanks and heartfelt congratulations for sustaining this great tradition of academic and institutional excellence. Thank you. Thanks to you, we have an incredible foundation for the next 70 years. It is now my honor to call to the podium Professor Tsitsi Musasike, who will introduce our keynote speaker, Vanessa Nakate. Professor Musasike is professor of the practice of global development policy. She joined the Pardee School just last year after a distinguished career in project finance, including at most recently at the Development Bank of Southern Africa, where she conducted essential work in financing and the implementation of renewable energy policies and projects. Here at Pardee, she teaches courses such as climate change and development, among others. But certainly on her climate change courses, she's addressing issues very close to the heart of our distinguished lecturer this evening. Please join me in welcoming Professor Tsitsi Musasike.
Thank you, Scott, for those kind words. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Habari za jioni, mgwede oma, memawajo, saubona, maneru, salibonani, buenas noches, buenas noches, mesdames et messieurs, bonsoir. All protocols observed. It's my absolute pleasure to introduce our speaker this evening, climate justice activist, Ms. Vanessa Nakate. We are so lucky, Vanessa, to have you this evening. Thank you so much for taking time out of your very hectic schedule. Climate is a subject we are all deeply interested in. We are all being affected in one way or the other by the impact of climate change. As parents, we aspire to leave a better planet behind for our children. As children, the question is always, how can you make your voice count when speaking truth to power about the realities of climate change? Vanessa knows too well the power of the youth voice in this very important conversation. Ms. Nakate has been a forceful spokesperson on the particular challenges faced by people on the African continent, who are responsible for such a small fraction of greenhouse gases, but who suffer disproportionately from this man-made crisis. She is the founder of the Rise Up movement, which seeks to elevate the voices of African climate activists. Ms. Nakate is a UNICEF Goodwill Ambassador, an awardee of the 2023 Time CO2 Earth Awards, and she has been nominated along with Greta Thunberg for the Nobel Peace Prize this year. She's an author of the book, A Bigger Picture, a manifesto on inclusive climate action. Time magazine named Ms. Nakate its Time 100 Next List in 2021. Ms. Nakate and her work have been featured in the New York Times, The Guardian, Vox, The Huffington Post, the International Women's Forum, and on CNN, the BBC, PBS, and the United Nations media. So we are truly blessed to have Ms. Nakate share some of her work with us this evening. After her remarks, Ms. Nakate will engage in a conversation with PADI students on these issues and then take some questions from the audience. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming our Bradford Morse distinguished lecturer for this evening, climate justice activist coming all the way from Uganda, Ms. Vanessa Nakate.
Good evening, everyone. Good evening, everyone. I want to thank Boston University for offering me the opportunity to address all of you here at the African Studies Center's 70th anniversary gala. I believe that one alumni from Boston University study abroad program in Niger is the American politician Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. Last week, Congresswoman Ocasio-Cortez stood shoulder to shoulder with thousands of climate activists in the streets of New York City, calling on leaders around the world to enact a fair, fast, and forever phase out of fossil fuels. So even in this one moment that I've experienced during my visit in the United States, I am witnessing evidence that the work Boston University is doing to expose young people to the history and culture of Africa, and also to the issues that are impacting the African people, is bearing fruit. There is no other issue that is as critical to Africa as climate change. And now that it is beginning to feel true for all regions of this world, it seems that everywhere we look now, communities are on fire. Everywhere we look now, communities are drowning. We are watching our fields turn to dust. We are watching our coral reefs bleach and disintegrate. People's lungs are filled with toxic air. People are struggling to breathe. This summer, all of this was heartbreakingly clear in places like Maui, Hawaii, and in the great forests of Canada, and in the coastal towns of the Mediterranean. There is a sense that with climate change, we are now all in the same storm. Nowhere is safe anymore. Nowhere is safe any longer. And yet, across the African continent, the climate crisis is already harming food security, ecosystems, and economies, fueling displacement and migration, and worsening the threat of conflict over dwindling resources. The World Health Organization announced that 1 in 3 people across Africa are facing water scarcity. The World Bank announced that by 2050, 86 million Africans will be forced to leave their homes and try to find somewhere else to exist. And after years of failed rains, the World Food Programme says that 22 million people are at risk of famine across the Horn of Africa. So yes, Africa is incredibly vulnerable to the climate crisis. But on top of this vulnerability, there is also a suffocating injustice. Africa is responsible for only a fraction of global greenhouse gas emissions, but is suffering disproportionately from the climate crisis. The entire continent of Africa is responsible for less than 4% of global greenhouse gas emissions. For comparison, the United States is responsible for 29% of global emissions. So yes, we are all in the same storm, but we are in very different boats. On September 4th, Storm Daniel dumped more than 2 feet of rain on parts of Greece. But as the storm traveled over the Mediterranean, it was boosted by sea temperatures that were 2 to 3 degrees warmer than average for early September. That extra warmth fueled stronger winds and allowed the air to hold more moisture. The storm turned into a Mediterranean storm with the characteristics of a tropical cyclone. As Storm Daniel approached Libya, the storm dumped rain over the mountains above the coastal city of Dana. More than a foot of rain fell in 24 hours. 2 dams that had been constructed in the hills above Dana collapsed. A torrent of water swept down the hills and through the city. Thousands of people were dragged out to the sea. Huge sections of the city were completely destroyed. And weeks later, bodies are still washing up on the beaches. The Libyan people are still counting the dead. So you see, it was the same storm, but we are in different boats. As we sit here this evening, at this lovely gala, a state of emergency has been declared in New York City amidst heavy rainfall and flash flooding, just after the New York Climate Week. While in South Africa's Western Cape Province, people are trying to cope with extreme rain and strong winds, which have caused flooding, ripped off roofs, destroyed crops, and taken lives. Again, this is the same storm, heartbreakingly different boats. Cyclone Idai devastated communities across Mozambique in March of 2019. The International Monetary Fund agreed to grant Mozambique a high-interest loan to help rebuild its infrastructure. It is a shocking indictment of the international community that a country as impoverished as Mozambique has to borrow from international institutions in order to cope with the devastation of a cyclone that they did not cause. Many of the rich nations that underwrite the IMF became rich by extracting and burning fossil fuels in the first place. We are all in the same storm, but we are in different boats. On top of this, while we desperately need to transition to clean energy, let's not forget that at present, 600 million people, or 43% of the entire population of Africa, lack access to electricity, most of them in sub-Saharan Africa. So how do we make this better? First of all, while Africa is hugely vulnerable to climate change, and much of the continent still suffers from energy poverty, Africa can and must be a part of the solution. Africa has 39% of the world's renewable energy potential, more than any other continent. And according to the International Energy Agency, Africa has 60% of the world's best solar resources. But to do this, we must begin to make things right. We must make things fair. The Global North has a historical debt to pay to the Global South. It must make good on commitments for finance for climate-vulnerable countries. And let's stop talking about the $100 billion per year that was first promised back in 2009 and has still not materialized. We are no longer talking about billions that are needed, but trillions. We need rich countries to put real money into the loss and damage fund that was agreed at COP27. Poorer African countries are stuck in a vicious cycle where they pay more for electricity, cannot afford the high upfront cost of clean energy, and are locked into fossil fuel projects. The World Bank must change the rules and make it affordable for Africa to transition to renewable energy. And we must do away with the debt and the high interest loans that are suffocating the Global South. And rich countries which have long benefited from fossil fuels must stop all new development of coal, oil, and gas now. As the UN Secretary General has repeatedly said, investment in fossil fuels is moral and economic madness. President Biden administration may want to praise itself for signing the Inflation Reduction Act into law, but the United States is simultaneously planning more than 1/3 of the world's entire planned global oil and gas expansion through 2050. So I would like to say this now to President Biden. If your country's expansion of oil and gas would by itself put 1.5 degrees Celsius target out of reach, then you cannot call yourself a climate leader, sir. The US has a moral obligation, especially to those who are already suffering and dying on the front lines of the climate crisis, to end all new fossil fuel development now. On top of all of this, as we rise up to meet the climate crisis, we must not repeat the same mistakes. We must not replace the extractive colonialism of the fossil fuel industry with a new extractive colonialism of the critical minerals needed for scaling up renewable energy. We must let local communities make decisions about clean energy. It is vital that green jobs doesn't just mean short-term construction work, but long-term secure employment in sectors that contribute to national development. We must treat people fairly. We must take care of the most vulnerable. We must leave no one behind. So yes, we are in very different boats, but we are in the same storm. So as the storm begins to rage harder and harder, we have a moral responsibility to make room for the people who are in smaller boats. We have a moral responsibility to make room for people in boats that are taking on water. We have a moral responsibility to make room for people who are desperately clinging to the remnants of their boats and who have only hope to grasp onto. Let us not forget, a rising tide lifts all boats. Let the tide rise with justice. Let the tide rise with equity. Let the tide rise with love. Thank you.
Vanessa Nakate, thank you so much for those important words. You're carrying this message all over Boston and all over the world, and we're so pleased. I want to say that folks are telling me, please eat your salads a little bit so we can keep moving along. So please do that, if you don't mind, quietly as you can. But I'd also like to say that our emphasis this evening is on climate justice, but it's also on youth. And we are a school, a university, and a center focused on young people. And so I'm very proud right now to ask to come to the podium two of our superb Pardee students. Could I call up Victoria Bien-Aimé and Senedi Aveni? I'm just going to say very briefly by way of introduction that Victoria is an MA candidate in International Affairs at Pardee. She specializes in global economic affairs with a regional focus on Africa. She hails from, and I didn't know this, even though we've chatted many times, from Mauritius and somehow Nigeria and Ethiopia all at the same time. Pretty good. And her career interests involve labor migration, climate adaptation, and women's empowerment. Senedi Aveni is a senior undergraduate with family roots in Côte d'Ivoire. She's engaged in internships with the Department of State, as many as we can force her to take, including with the U.S. Embassy in France, working for my former boss there. She's also done an internship with Médecins Sans Frontières in Geneva. She's majoring in international relations and public health, and she's passionate about public service. I'm delighted to say that. Healthcare, culture, and she aims to have a positive impact in global public health. Ladies and gentlemen, a conversation.
Thank you everyone for coming tonight, and thank you so much, Vanessa, for speaking on the issue of climate change. Your message is very, very powerful. I just wanted to start off with, could you share what initially motivated you to first get involved into climate activism, and whether it's like a specific event, individuals, and how they motivated you to be engaged in the ways that you've been engaged so far?
Thank you very much. In 2018, I started to do research about some of the challenges that the people in my country, Uganda, were facing. And in that moment, I got to learn that climate change was one of those challenges. And especially in the eastern part of Uganda, in areas of Bududa, Bundibujo, I had seen the flooding and the landslides. And for me, this was the moment that I decided I wanted to do something about climate change. I wanted to raise awareness. And at that time, there was the Fridays for Future climate strikes that were started by Greta Thunberg from Sweden. So I was really inspired by her to start striking as well for the climate. At that time, she was just 15 years old. And she really sparked off such a powerful, movement of children and young people from different parts of the world. And, every time I remember that moment when I saw her very first strike, it makes me think about how, no one is too small to make a difference, and no action is too small to transform the world. And along the way, I got to learn about different environmentalists as well, like the late Professor Wangari Maathai, who I wish we had been taught about in school, and about the work that she did in Kenya. So I think for me, those are some of the people that I've greatly learned from in my journey of activism.
Thank you. As you were speaking and telling us how long you've been doing this, a question popped up. You've probably had a lot of interviews, so maybe what's one question that you have never been asked, but that you wish that you had been asked? I just wanted to know something that you want to share, but that you never really got the chance to.
Wow, it's really hard to think of something right now, because I get asked a lot of questions. But maybe if it comes up later on, I can mention it.
Well, the one question that I do have is, and you can tell me if you've ever been asked that already, but could you maybe share some of the challenges and maybe frustrations, but also rewards that you've had during this whole activism career, and especially as a young female activist from Uganda? Any special experiences and frustrations?
Yeah, obviously, with activism, it comes with its own challenges as well, and I believe that probably some of our elders here who have been involved in activism work even before us, they understand that. And I think for me, when I had just started activism, some of the challenges that came were, mostly directed towards me being a young woman standing on the streets and holding placards, because to some people, they thought that I was standing on the streets to seek for attention or to find a man to marry me. Yeah, I think it's the first time I've laughed so hard. Yeah, because it's very funny now that I think about it.
Right.
It's like 5 years later, and I'm not yet married, so. Yeah, but at that time, being a young activist. I think that was very challenging for me, very hurting as well. And also I just thought about how different young women or different girls who would love to get involved in activism, and that's the first thing someone would say to them, that they are seeking attention. And I think many young women experience this because society kind of has like its own rules on how girls ought to behave, and how their lives are planned out. From school, you get married, or you get a job, you have children. So I think for many, it's no one says it, but in a way, society has kind of framed the lives of every girl like that. So maybe if they see that you're now in your 20s, then automatically they think you're seeking for attention or trying to attract someone. I think the other challenge, I think the biggest challenge in my activism was the time when I was cropped out of a picture with fellow activists who were from Europe. Again, I think it doesn't hurt as much as it did at that time, because I was much younger then, and I remember that moment. It was very frustrating and very heartbreaking. It felt very. I would never do that to someone, so it felt very shocking to see that was done. But I'm just glad that in that moment, when I asked why I had been removed from the picture, there were so many people that were so supportive in that moment, because I could have said something and no one would have paid attention. But when I asked the question of why I'd been removed from the picture, almost everyone started to ask the same question. And that really gave me a lot of support and a lot of strength. And it's because of that I've been introduced to audiences like this. Yeah.
I feel like coming from an African country and having to, I guess, make more of an effort to stand out, to be like, my voice still counts, just because African countries tend to be neglected in a lot of these discussions. It is tough, but that just shows how big of a light you shine for the world to see, and also for African countries. Another question we had was, how do you even approach those who are still skeptical about climate change, climate activism, how to address it, and stuff like that, and those who are even just hesitant to go out there? Like, if you're saying that young girls are too scared to go out because there's already a perception and it looks like they're going away from that traditional thing, what would you best advise us as the audience, as well as just young girls out there, about how to navigate that?
Yeah, well, I would say that, social media or the world is always not so easy, especially to young girls. But I think what could be helpful, it's always good to see people who have kind of walked in those shoes before you, and I didn't really see that. Like I said, we didn't learn about people like Professor Wangari Maathai in school. We learned so much about European history, but we didn't know much about our own history. So I think if they showed us, more people who looked like us, who walked in these spaces, who conquered these spaces, I think that would have given me more strength. That would have given me more hope. And I think that that's why when I came here, one of the things that I really appreciated was how there is a lot of African studies. I visited the library, and there's just so much there. So I think if there was access, if people could access, especially young girls, if people could access and see, those people that walked before them, that looked like them, I think that would give us strength. I believe that every new birth is as a result of an old womb. And I believe that me being able to stand in these spaces, or the three of us being able to sit here and have this conversation, it's because there is someone who set this foundation for us. There is someone who set this path for us. And again, I'm thankful to be for organizing, this moment of three incredible young Black women, because I think that these spaces are not so available, they're not so accessible, but to be here standing on the shoulders of those that came before us, I think for me, that is what really gives me strength. So we need I learned something from one man of God who said that, you cannot, a tree, it doesn't matter how high it grows, if it's not strongly rooted, it will break. So it doesn't matter how high I go, it doesn't matter how high we all go, if we don't have any roots that are holding us, we will come crashing down, and it will be so quick. Usually the rise may take steps, but the tumbling down is so quick. So that's why I really emphasize the importance of, having those people that we can learn from, that can guide us, that went before us. I think that will motivate us as young women to know that if Professor Wangari Maathai did it, then I can do it as well. Yeah.
Okay, so I think we have time for one more question.
Okay.
So when it comes to addressing climate change, you emphasize that Africa has to be a part of the solution. But how distinct should the roles of developed countries and multinational corporations that are polluting a lot be in comparison to developing countries who aren't polluting as much? Do you believe that maybe developing countries can still justify the use of fossil fuels as they strive for development, and Western countries have used it, so it's kind of like, what do you think about that?
Yeah, that is a very complicated question.
Yeah.
Well, fossil fuel companies have for decades promised to lift people out of poverty on the African continent. And yet, like you've heard, 600 million people still don't have access to basic electricity. I've had the opportunity to speak to a number of students while in Boston, and there's a student who was from Nigeria who told me that, she was so disturbed about the poverty, about the unemployment in her country, and yet there is a lot of fossil fuel investments in Nigeria. So the question is, who actually benefits from these investments? So I remember in school, there's always a question about the disadvantages of foreign investments. And one common answer that every student knew was profit repatriation. And it has been so evident within the fossil fuel industry. And that's why even when we call for a just transition, we call for one that is not built on the same extractive colonial system. Because now that everyone is talking about Now that everyone is talking about a just transition, there is a huge rush for the critical minerals. Many of these minerals are on the African continent. Many of these minerals are on indigenous lands. But when you look at the DRC, for example, it has many of these minerals. I've worked with activists from the DRC, but they say that, what people call as just transition of, electrical vehicles, it is violence in their communities. It is harm in their communities. It is not benefiting their communities. So you may find that the same oil cars that we've seen on the African continent could turn into the same solar cars or just transition cars, because we find ourselves in the same old extractive system. So for developing countries, continuing any new investment in fossil fuels would harm or would take away our fighting chance of 1.5 degrees. And the IEA, International Energy Agency, has made it very clear. The IPCC has made it very clear. So it's really not a question of do they deserve to use their resources? It's a question of what is it going to do to communities? What is it going to do to the planet? And we know that any new fossil fuel investment is going to bring harm to communities, is going to bring harm to the same communities that are already, that are healing from wounds of, historical harm and pain. So that's why we call for a just transition. But even for the just transition, it has to be led by our communities. It has to be led by our governments, because again, it can become, the same curse, So again, this is what makes this fight, so hard, because recently, I think just this week, the UK government approved the Rosebank oil field after activists organizing against it. So it makes this fight very hard when the countries that are heavily responsible for the climate crisis are first of all not taking that historical responsibility, but they are also fueling the crisis. So it's going to be hard for African governments to say they're not going to invest. It's going to take a lot of work of activists to actually convince our governments that Africa can still take another pathway of development. And we know that it can work. But what we need are the investments. When we talk about a just transition, we are talking about a shift, from this old extractive system that has brought harm to ecosystems and people, to a world that ensures that our people are protected, that ensures that our planet is protected as well. But it's going to need a lot of, working together, working united to tell our governments that, Africa can still take a pathway that ensures that we have a better planet, a better planet and a better future for all of us. Because in the end, all these fossil fuel investments, they're going to become stranded assets. They're going to increase debt for African countries, and they're not going to benefit African countries. If someone could tell me that there is a country maybe in Africa that has benefited from that, that could be a place of argument. But then we've seen that most of the countries within Africa that have, had heavy investment in fossil fuels, they haven't actually benefited from that. So what we need is a just transition, one that doesn't leave anyone behind, one that doesn't leave Africa behind. Because Africa, honestly, it has the resources that have changed the course of this world, and it has the resources that could change the course of this just transition. But we have to be very careful about how that transition happens. Again, we have to ensure that it's not the same extractive system that takes away resources, labor from the African continent and leaves just profits for the minority, within governments or people who actually get to work in those companies. So we need African voices to take charge of the just transition conversation. We recently held a just transition summit, and very few young people in Africa knew much about what a just transition means, and yet all of us are saying we need a just transition. So we need capacity building, not just for young people, but even our own governments, to be able to drive the agenda of a just transition, because there is definitely going to be a rush for critical minerals, and we may see history repeat itself again.
Thank you so much. We're going to open up questions to the audience. If anyone has any questions they would like to answer, a few microphones are going to be going around. So if you raise your hand, there and one in the back. And again, thank you so much.
I want to hear about your community organizing. How do you do it? Who gets involved? How does it work? What makes it successful? Because to go from nothing to everything takes community organizing.
Yeah.
So let us know.
Well, thank you very much. I'll use the example of one of the projects that we started in 2019, and involves the installation of solar panels and clean cooking stoves in schools in Uganda. You know, many times people may see us doing more work globally, but we are actually doing work as well on the grassroots level. Most of the schools in Uganda heavily use firewood for preparation of food, and many of the schools, especially in the rural areas, don't have access to electricity. So through this project, we've been able to bring cleaner ways of cooking that reduce on the consumption of firewood, but also bring electricity to schools that haven't had, access to light for like 6 decades, 5 decades. We started in 2019 with 1 school, and now we've reached 64 schools, impacting about more than 20,000 children. And it's been a work of, different activists, supervising the constructions and making sure that everything is successful. Activists trying to figure out funding for the project, like Darius, who loves to stay, he's there. Yeah.
Thank you.
To stay behind closed doors, but it's been a work of different activists that have actually that we've actually been able to have this project move from 1 school to 64 schools. And we're kind of ambitious. We want to reach 20,000 schools. We don't know when that will happen, but yeah, that's like an example of grassroots organizing that we've done. Yeah.
We'll have one more question.
Yes, thank you so much. My name is Ronnie Mayanja. I happen to come from Uganda, and I'm also a graduate of Boston University College of Communication. I also attended the APAC Center here. I did my thesis with Professor, I think it was Ambassador Steve. My question, and I'm also the founder of Uganda Diaspora Network here in Boston, and a board member of the Africa Boston Festival. I would love to know what support, if any, you get from our government, knowing that they're kind of, with the discovery of oil in Hoima, and of course, them trying to get the pipeline funded and all that. I would love to get a sense of what kind of support are you getting from our government, and also appreciate you, because I come from Uganda. We want to celebrate you, and we thank you so much, Boston University, for the invitation to be part of this event. Thank you.
Well, I think the support that we receive from the government is about 0%. But I think Uganda as a country has kind of been very big on climate change work, but mostly on adaptation. So it's okay to raise awareness about climate change. It's okay to talk about climate adaptation. It's okay to talk about loss and damage. But now it's a problem to talk about the oil pipeline. And there have been activists that have worked directly against the oil pipeline. We've done it as well with Davis and other activists. But there are some that are directly with the Stop ECOP movement, and we've seen probably in the news they've been constantly harassed and also arrested as well. So it's really been a challenge, and I think that many times governments would prefer to work with people that that they can easily limit on what they can say or what they can do. So we've also kind of tried to stay away from working very closely with government, because you want to be able to talk about, what we think is important. So no, there's really no support. Yeah. I remember the question. So usually people are asking me questions, but they never give me the opportunity to ask them questions.
Oh.
So maybe you can tell us about the work that each of you are doing as well.
The work and issues that I'm doing or involved in?
Any, I mean.
Oh, okay. That's a great question. I've never been asked that question, but no, I'm kidding. Well, thank you for that question. So, as a senior in undergraduate at Boston University, majoring in international relations, I mostly have classes. So, what would I like to do with my time, and what am I able to do, to still be an active member of society and take what I learned in classes and actually put it into practice? Um, I travel when I get the chance to. That was thwarted by COVID, of course, but I love discovering new cultures. I love being able to learn more about Africa, which is why I take classes at the ASC. Shameless plug because it's the Gala. So those classes really inform the things and kind of break the old narratives that I've been taught in school and Western-centric narratives. So being able to go visit countries like Senegal or Mali or yes, or Ethiopia or Kenya. I got these earrings from Kenya. So I hope to visit Uganda one day to be able to actually see communities, interact with their cultures, their foods, because I'm very passionate about that. And in the long run, have an impact in public health, which is also related to the environment and social determinants of health. So yes, right now it's classes. Soon it will be action on the ground, whether through policy work or whatever happens in my career, I guess.
Yeah.
Was not prepared at all for this, but I started international development my sophomore year of college in Michigan. I do come from 3 different African countries. My mom is Nigerian, my dad is from Mauritius, but I was born and raised in Ethiopia because my dad worked for the African Union. So I've gone to see all these leaders come to Addis to like have these conversations and have these big discussions. And one thing I loved about what you said is that we're tired of hearing all these fancy speeches. Like, let's see the actions actually come out, you know? So seeing that, I remember because I also hold my faith very like central to why I'm even in international development studies, because it's the vulnerable populations who've done the least that suffer the most. And it's painful seeing that and still being able to enjoy. And like, because I lived such a, like, honestly, a very great life, but I'm surrounded by that poverty. And I'm seeing how people who are the same age as me are selling on the streets just to make it through the day. I was like, this is meant for me. I want to know why they're poor and how can I make their lives a bit better. So when I first got in, I remember I said I wanted to work especially with the youth as well as with women, just because they tend to be more vulnerable to climate change, and knowing that there's a huge shift now in terms of male out migration to urban areas, and women are taking on more labor. It is a form of empowerment, but how also is it a form of burden? If there's less access in terms of agricultural inputs and stuff, and they're going to be the ones kind of holding all of Africa together. And then food insecurity is going to be a huge issue, and that's the main thing I'm focusing now in my master's program in terms of just labor migration, labor participation, and how is Africa creating the new model of development rather than always seeking European countries or the US. But rather than always holding other countries as the standard for development, it's now like, we see how you guys done it. This is where we are now. Let's show you another way. Rather than having that victim mentality, like, yes, we're always the ones being hurt, but now it's like, let's show and also be that platform for people of all these different backgrounds, different specializations to come together. And that's what I love about what you do. It's everyone coming together to come towards addressing this major issue that affects us all. We're all in different boats, but we're all affected by the same storm. And that is such a powerful message. And the youth who often feel like we have to leave it to our leaders. Like, I love to talk with people and just have conversations, and especially because I am half Nigerian, and having traveled to Ghana and South Africa and just sitting with people and just talking, like, I don't really do much outside of that other than giving them hope to be like, you can actually make a change. You know, it's like, if you're, like, by you getting your education, you have such a privilege to change the world in your field, you know? And it's like, we're all collectively working together, and it's like, it gives each of us hope. And as you said, building those roots, we have the whole world as our roots, you know? So, yeah, that's hopefully.
And I have to say, I love that she turned it around on you and forced you to answer questions too. So I'd just like to say, everyone, we're going to now sit down for dinner. And as we sit down for dinner, you'll have your programs. If the spirit moves you, on the back of your program, there's a QR code where you could donate to support the work of the African Studies Center. You're here. And I want to say that it's right there. Do you see it? Is it the right place? Yes, and that money will go to support principally students for their research and their travel. You will also find on your tables these cards where you can write down memories of your time with the African Studies Center, or you can just make comments, and incidentally, you can do so anonymously. I know we're asking for it by doing that, but you can do so anonymously if you'd like. And our librarians are continuously collecting history and archiving people's thoughts and memories. Finally, I want to say that, not quite finally, you have tickets. You should have received tickets. If you haven't, I have some extras. And so you can go get beverages out there at the bar. So please go ahead, and if you don't use all your tickets, give them to your friends so they can use them. Finally, during dinner, and already we've been listening, we're going to be very fortunate to have with us Albino Mb. And he is get ready for this, multi-award winning musician, guitarist, singer, composer, sound engineer, music producer, and Berklee College of Music professor. That's an awful lot all in one place. He is from Mozambique. He made his first guitar when he was 15 years old out of a tin can. How did it play? I have no idea, but he did it. And he moved to the United States to attend Berklee College of Music in 2009, and he was among the first Africans to be awarded a full tuition scholarship there by the Berklee African Scholars Program. He combines rhythmic patterns and musical concepts to create a unique, I hope I pronounced this correctly, marabenta, Nakate, Afro-pop, and Moz jazz sound. So that's plenty. Albino will be accompanied by his band members, Ebinho Cardoso and Matthew William. So a round of applause for our band as they begin. And please enjoy your dinner.
They say our language is a one. No one speaks it anymore, but I do. They say our costumes out of date. No one wants them anymore. Our history has no cobwebs because no one ever wrote it down. Our traditions have vanished in the clouds after the storm. Don't you wanna know? Don't you wanna know? Don't you wanna know where you come from? Don't you wanna know? Don't you wanna know where you come from? Don't you want your kids to know that there is hope beyond the horizon? Because I do. Don't you want your kids to believe that they can find it again? Because I do. Our history has no cobwebs because no one ever wrote it down. Our traditions have vanished like clouds after the storm. Don't you wanna know? I refuse to be an orphan, a leaf floating in the air, a verse that no mouth ever claimed. Our future is hidden in the sacred place. Oh, 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 oh. Don't you wanna know? Don't you wanna know where you come from? Don't you wanna know? Don't you wanna know where you come from? Don't you wanna know? Don't you wanna know where you come from? Don't you wanna know? Don't you wanna know where you come from? Could we sing together and celebrate communities and diversity? Don't you wanna know? Don't you wanna know where you come from? Don't you wanna know? Don't you wanna know where you come from? Don't you wanna know? Don't you wanna know where you come from? Don't you wanna know? Don't you wanna know where you come from? Oh, oh, hey, yeah. Oh, hey, yeah. Oh, don't you wanna know? Don't you wanna know where you come from? Don't you wanna know? Don't you wanna know where you come from? Don't you wanna know? Don't you wanna know where you come from? Don't you wanna know? Don't you wanna know where you come from?